eat jelly beans while I do this. It's part of the thing. Hey, I'm back with part two of what is a three-part episode on the external confirmation of details in the New Testament. Last time around, we took a look at how we know things about Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great, and Socrates. And this time around, we're going to look at all of the extra-biblical sources that have to do with Jesus and the early church and see how they stack up. Okay, you've been very patient with all of the theoretical stuff. Let's get on to some specifics. What I'm going to look at now are excerpts from authors from the first century around the time of Christ who mentioned stuff about Jesus and the early church. I think you'll find this fascinating. Okay, number one, a guy named Tacitus. He was an historian who wrote around 100 AD. Here's something he had to say. Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. With each of these accounts that I'm going to read to you, I'm going to point out what things we can glean about the story of Jesus in the early church. In this, we see that Jesus was executed, that happened during the reign of Tiberius. We see that Christianity found its origins in Judea, and that it was significant enough to be pushed back upon during the reign of Nero, which was in the 60s AD. Number two, a guy named Lucian, a mid-1st century Greek author, said this: "The Christians, you know, worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage, who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account. You see, these misguided creatures start with the general conviction that they are immortal for all time, which explains the contempt of death and voluntary self-devotion which are so common among them. And then it was impressed on them by their original lawgiver that they're all brothers. From the moment that they are converted and deny the gods of Greece and worship the crucified sage and live after his laws. All this they take quite on faith, with the result that they despise all worldly goods alike, regarding them merely as common property." Okay, there's a ton there that sounds a whole lot like what we're seeing in Luke and Acts. Christians worship Jesus as God. They believe in eternal life. They're brave in the face of persecution. They count themselves as brothers and sisters. They only worship one God. Jesus was crucified, and they held their property in common, apparently meeting the needs of the poor. Those are 7 details that provide, in and of themselves, a pretty solid framework for what this whole story is about. But there's a lot more. A third author, Suetonius, who I mentioned earlier, wrote around 100 AD. He was a biographer of Claudius. He was a Roman, and it's a brief mention, but he says this: "As the Jews were making constant disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, Claudius expelled them from Rome." Presumably this Chrestus is Christ, but it certainly matches up with the timeline and indicates a brief Claudian persecution because he misunderstood the relationship between Christianity and the Jews. Fourth, a guy named Thallus. Thallus apparently wrote in the mid-1st century, but we don't have any actual copies of his manuscripts. Instead, we can figure out that he wrote a book because a whole bunch of other people quote him in their works that do still exist. Thallus was interested in the natural world and observed a strange phenomenon that he recorded. Here's a quote of Thallus from the 1st century AD. "On the whole world there pressed a most fearful darkness, and the rocks were rent by an earthquake, and many places in Judea and other districts were thrown down. This darkness Thallus, in the 3rd book of his history, calls, as appears to me without reason, an eclipse of the sun." So later authors recorded this guy having said, there was a weird earthquake and an unpredicted eclipse that shouldn't have happened at the time that it happened. Obviously, all of this stuff lines up with the account of the crucifixion and some of the natural phenomena that occurred at that moment. But wait, there's more. Number 5, a guy named Pliny. Sometimes you'll hear it said Pliny. I don't know, whichever. Say whatever you want. The guy who I'm going to call Pliny was a representative of the emperor who worked in modern-day Turkey. And one of his tasks was to get to the bottom of what the deal was with this Christian religion and to execute a persecution that was to be carried out against them. He wrote back to the Emperor Trajan the following report: "They, the Christians, were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light, when they sang in alternate verses a hymn to Christ as to a God, and bound themselves by a solemn oath not to any wicked deeds, but never to commit any fraud, theft, or adultery, never to falsify their word, nor deny a trust when they should be called upon to deliver it up. After which it was their custom to separate and then reassemble to partake of food, but food of an ordinary and innocent kind." He goes on in another letter: "I asked them directly if they were Christians. Those who persisted I ordered away. Those who denied they were or ever had been Christians worshipped both your image and the images of the gods and cursed Christ. They used to gather on a stated day before dawn and sing to Christ as if he were a god. All the more I believed it necessary to find out what was the truth from 2 servant maids which were called deaconesses by means of torture. Nothing more did I find than a disgusting fanatical superstition. Therefore I stopped the examination and hastened to consult you on account of the number of people endangered. For many of all ages, all classes, and both sexes already are brought into danger. There's a ton going on here, and this is coming from a hostile source, but you gotta admit the Christians come off looking pretty dang good in this account. From Pliny's correspondence with Trajan, we can deduce then that Christians met weekly, that they sang songs about God, that they viewed Jesus as God, that they had a code of Christian morality based on the teachings of Christ, that they met each other's needs, that they were evangelistic, and that they were persecuted by Rome. So there's 7 more things that give us a sense of what the church looks like, and if you've been with me on this Acts thing, that sounds just like what we're seeing in Luke's account. A 6th source is the Talmud, a Jewish document probably written around the 3rd century AD. Obviously this would not be a flattering account of the history of Jesus, but it's an account nonetheless. It goes like this. On the eve of the Passover, Yeshua, Jesus, was hanged. For 40 days before the execution took place, a herald went forth and cried, "He's going forth to be stoned because he's practiced sorcery and enticed Israel to apostasy. Anyone who can say nothing in his favor, let him come forward and plead on his behalf." But since nothing was brought forward in his favor, he was hanged on the eve of the Passover. Stuff we can glean from this. Jesus was crucified, he did miracles, people followed him, and his support momentarily waned during his trial and execution. 7th, here's another Jewish source, a guy named Mara bar Serapion, who was writing after the destruction of the temple, so just after 70 AD. This guy's account might be considered favorable toward Christianity, so you can decide for yourself whether this counts as a extra biblical non-Christian source once you've heard it for yourself. What he had to say goes like this. What advantage did the Athenians gain from putting Socrates to death? Famine and plague came upon them as a judgment for their crime. What advantage did the men of Samos gain from burning Pythagoras? In a moment, their land was covered with sand. What advantage did the Jews gain from executing their wise king? It was after that that their kingdom was abolished. God justly avenged these 3 wise men. The Athenians died of hunger. The Samians were overwhelmed by the sea. The Jews, ruined and driven from their land, live in complete dispersion. But Socrates didn't die for good. He lived on in the teachings of Plato. Pythagoras didn't die for good. He lived on in the statue of Hera. Nor did the wise king die for good. He lived on in the teaching which he'd given. Regardless of whether or not you agree with his position, we can still gather historically that Jesus was regarded as a wise teacher, that people followed him, and that he was crucified at the behest of the Jews. 8th, a guy named Celsus, who was a harsh Roman critic of Christianity who wrote in the mid-100s. He said the following. Jesus, on account of his poverty, was hired out to go to Egypt. While there, he acquired certain magical powers. He returned home highly elated at possessing these powers, and on the strength of them, gave himself out to be a god. It was by these means of sorcery that he was able to accomplish the wonders which he performed. Let us believe that these cures, or the resurrection, or the feeding of a multitude with a few loaves, these are nothing more than the tricks of jugglers. It is by the names of certain demons and by the use of incantations that the Christians appear to be possessed of miraculous power. Celsus's attacks on Christianity were so aggressive that they drew responses from key early church leaders like Origen. Even though what Celsus wrote was obviously biting and fully condemning of Christianity and anybody who would believe that stuff, still the fact that he wrote it, that it was a big enough deal to be responded to, and in the details he wrote down, we get further external corroboration of some of the details of Jesus in the early church. We can gather that Jesus went to Egypt, that he had power, that he proclaimed deity, that he specifically raised from the dead, that he specifically healed, that he specifically fed a multitude, and implicitly we can gather that the church mattered enough by this point for Celsus to throw his energy into this criticism. 9th, a guy named Josephus also wrote about this stuff. He's maybe the most famous first century historian out of the Jewish ranks. He was a Jew who fought on the side of the Jews when they rebelled against Rome, but then when he realized that Rome was definitely going to win, he flipped sides and eventually became a Roman historian. He wrote great big volumes that tell us all kinds of things about the early age of the emperors in the 1st century AD, and not surprisingly, Jesus does come up in what he writes. But what Josephus had to say is contested. I am of the opinion that some of Josephus's famous quote about Jesus, that I'll read to you in a second, is a later addition by an eager Christian. But I'll let you hear it anyway. Here's how it sounds. Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ, and when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct to this day. It doesn't make sense to me that Josephus, who never converted to Christianity as best as we can tell, would have written in such favorable and even theologically accurate terms about the nature of Jesus in a history that was meant to be read by Romans. Additionally, the earliest manuscripts of Josephus don't include this stuff. It only shows up later on. But that doesn't mean the thing is a hoax or not useful to us. So let's just say that that was a later edition and take the version Josephus most likely wrote without any of those additions and see if it's useful on its own merit. Listen to this. About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, for he was one who wrought surprising feats and was a teacher of such people as accepted the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. When Pilate, upon hearing him accused by men of the highest standing among us, had condemned him to be crucified, those who had in the first place come to love him did not give up their affection for him, and the tribe of Christians, so called after him, has still to this day not disappeared. See, that's still pretty solid. There's a ton there for us to glean. Now, Josephus goes on and he also talks about John the Baptist and the trial and I think execution of James, brother of Jesus, later on. But for the sake of time, we'll skip over those. If we agree only to accept the less Christian version of Josephus's account, we still get a whole bunch of things from this that provide external corroboration, including Jesus lived, he was wise, he had followers, he did wonders. That following went beyond the Jews to the Gentiles or the Greeks. Pilate was in charge of his trial. He was crucified. The movement immediately persisted and still existed at the time that Josephus wrote this in the 80s or 90s AD. We're going to hit pause there on part 2. There will be a part 3 to this episode coming right up. I hope you're finding it fruitful. I'm Matt Whitman, and this has sort of been the 10-Minute Bible Hour.